putting in place a rule-based multilateral trade regime which embraces services, a regime which is fair and balanced, will make an enormous contribution and will be rewarding for all the stakeholders.
Lord Brittan, I was very struck by the Australian study that Craig gave us the benefit of, which showed what we had always thought, but with numbers, that it is the developed world that stands most to gain from the opening up of the services sector and from liberalisation. The developing world that stands most to gain from the opening up of the services sector. In a way, it's an interesting finding, but you quite understand why some people in the developing world may be reluctant to accept what follows from it, because the feeling that the services sector, with notable exception, of course, of IT in India, is an infant industry that needs protection, is a very natural feeling and a very seductive feeling. But actually, all the evidence shows that when you open up the services sector, say financial services, for example, to outside entrants, the consequence of that is not only beneficial for the economy, because the services sector is catalytic in its effect on the economy as a whole, but also, so far from destroying or nipping in the bud the infant services sector of the country concerned, actually, by the provision of expertise, by the provision of the dynamic, by the provision of know-how, leads to a growth in the indigenous service sector as well. So what I'm really making is a plea for the developing world to realize that this is not a case of the developed world trying to force its way in and getting something out of them, but an opportunity for the developing world to achieve greater levels of growth for themselves, and therefore to be positive in the negotiations on services, which I completely agree with Mr. Sharma, can't be seen in isolation, but are an extremely important component of the negotiation as a whole.
Okay, floor is open. Please identify yourself and then fire away.
Thank you. I'm Stephen Canner with the U.S. Council for International Business, and I'd like to address a question to Minister Emerson. I thought your remarks were quite on the spot. I also am an economist, used to be in the real world. You mentioned the role of the regulators. All the evidence about the importance of services and the potential for growth at the macro level is there, but the regulators say, fine, that's very nice, but we're not at the table. And if I were a regulator, I would say a threat to my authority, a threat to my power, and maybe a loss of my job. So how do you deal with that? What is your thinking as to how do we change the minds of the regulators so we can get on with this job of liberalizing services?
I think the answer to your question was in the question, and that is engaging the regulators. There's a first best solution to this, and that is to reduce the amount of regulation in the first place, and that's what we're trying to do in Australia. There's, in our country, over a period of 100 years, there's been an enormous amount of regulation thrown up, and when we talk about behind the borders, most of our difficult regulation for business is at the state level, and different types of regulation, different rules in different states have broken up our economy into up to 8 different economies, state economies and territory economies. We're moving towards a seamless national economy by harmonising or even unifying that regulation. So that's a first best solution. But where there are regulations, and of course as economists we tend to question the value of them, but we also need to acknowledge that there is a role for good, efficient regulation, then it's again human nature that, as I said in your question, I think you almost gave the answer. If we were to naively seek to negotiate outcomes that didn't involve the regulators, then they would ignore the results, because they'd say, well, I've had a trade minister or trade officials doing these negotiations for me. They don't really know what they're talking about. This is my life, and so I'm going to keep doing it. And I think that's why this is a more complex task than perhaps the conventional negotiations over tariff barriers, because the regulator is the customs department and it's metaphorically right there at the border. These are inside the country, they're often at state or provincial levels. And I think it is just incumbent upon the negotiators to involve the regulators. And that will mean, in our sorts of systems, a cabinet discussion of the sorts of offers that would be made, the requests that would be made. But I think there's no substitute, if it's feasible, and to the extent that it's feasible, of having the regulators involved directly in the negotiations, rather than them feel, as you say, hey, you're taking my job away from me, you're taking my life away from me, and I'm not going to cop that. So a different sort of negotiation, I think, is required to make the sort of progress that I think we can. The last point I'd make is that given there's been so little historic effort to negotiate the liberalisation of trade and services, there's probably rich pickings here compared with getting the last few drops out of negotiations on tariff rates, getting from 10 to 5 and 5 to 0. After in our country, for automotive tariffs, they've been at 57.5 and we're down to 5. Or we can get in a discussion about how to get from 5 to 0, but in the service economy, you're just starting. So I think the field is bigger, the pickings are richer. So despite the complexity, potentially, of involving the regulators in the negotiations, the rewards from a successful outcome can be very large indeed.
Secretary Ferrari.
The regulation, and probably because in Australia, in Mexico, we have faced this same disease of regulation and regulation and regulation. And just a few weeks ago, President Calder was presenting to the public a very important initiative in which we moved from 13,000 different regulations into 9 manuals. So it's a way of decreasing all this disease that we have been facing and creating for years. And I believe that you need to have a very, very strong approach into that, because sometimes, I mean, this is, for instance, my first time in the public service, and it's hard to learn that the first thing that you have to question yourself when you are serving to the people is that if you are in this position, you need to understand that rules are going to be done, laws are going to be done, and that means that you are also going to create, in a way, criminals, because they are not going to accomplish those laws and those regulations. And you should be sure that you are going to make them to do it. So that's a huge responsibility, and that's why you need to really understand in different ways what is what you are doing and what is what you have to change, what you need to change. And on that, of course, there are people that are going to get mad, and especially when that people make their lives or the way of living according to what they do, which means regulations itself. And just also, in the last month, we have unilaterally worked on these certifications of some electronic devices or medical devices, in which we in Mexico, as I said, unilaterally make a very important change on what we were doing, especially if we are integrated ourselves in NAFTA, Canada and US. What we have done is that those certifications that were already done in Canada and in US, we avoid to have a double process of certificating them also in Mexico. So